Were Aborigines the first Americans? Native tribes in the Amazon found to be more closely related to indigenous Australians. And it speaks of a genetic study that reveals Amazonian tribes. 3 of them share more DNA with Australian Aborigines than any other present-day population. And the study suggests that Aboriginal ancestors may have colonized South America. It challenges theories of how Native Americans first arrived in the Americas. Well, of course, this is the Daily Mail, so, we can expect sensational headlines. However, in this case, they're spot on, and the sensational headlines reveal even more sensational scientific research behind it. And this is a little extract from the scientific research. There's been this long-held view that there was a single origin for all Native American peoples, and that nevertheless that view has been challenged by some. But advances in DNA technology are making these kind of explorations much more possible. And what's been discovered is this very puzzling connection between the peoples of Australasia, particularly Papua New Guinea, and certain tribes deep in the Amazon rainforest. Now, this is a real mystery, because the view, I'll come to that, what makes it even more of a mystery is further research in 2018 on members of these tribes and looking for ancient skeletal remains. They found ancient skeletal remains 10,400 years old in the Amazon, which bear that same signal. And this tells us that this Aboriginal connection reached South America very, very long ago, and researchers are agreed that it must have reached South America in the late Pleistocene, which is near the end of the last ice age. It's a very important study because it establishes that there's no recent connection here. This is a very ancient connection in South America. And it really creates a problem because the view of archaeology for decades, really a century, has been that all the peopling of the Americas happened this way, that they crossed the Bering Straits, which were a land bridge during the Ice Age. Sea level was lower then, and that they traveled through North America and eventually down into South America. The problem is that this genetic signal isn't found anywhere in North America. It's only found in South America and in Papua New Guinea and neighboring areas. And I talked to Eski Willislev, who's one of the world's leading geneticists, whose recent work focuses on the peopling of the Americas. And I'll just read a bit of this email exchange. Willislev told me that currently no one has a good explanation of the Australo-Melanesian signal. All that's put forward as possible explanations are purely speculative. What we do know is that it's present in some Native American groups, particularly from Brazil. We also know it has to be pre-Columbian. Amongst the possible explanations for the presence of this Australo-Melanesian DNA in the Amazon, Professor Willislev offered in his email exchange with me the following. Someone holding this signal comes into the Americas not through Beringia, but crossing into South America across the ocean. Based purely on the genetic data, this is the most parsimonious explanation, but it does not make practical sense. So I asked Eski why it doesn't make practical sense. Is he basing that on the archaeological consensus that our upper Paleolithic and early Holocene ancestors were incapable of undertaking long transoceanic voyages? And his reply, in regard to crossing the Pacific, I'm not saying it did not happen, but there is no evidence suggesting that humans were capable of such a journey until quite late in history, the Polynesian expansion. It's a possibility, and I'm open to the idea, but there's not much evidence supporting it except going for the most parsimonious solution of the genetic data. Well, let me say right at the outset that in science, parsimony is looked for. It's best to look for the easiest and most direct and most simple explanation of something rather than elaborating huge other explanations. And this mysterious genetic signal in South America is best explained because none of it's in North America, by a crossing of the Pacific during the Ice Age, which supposedly our ancestors were incapable of doing. So we're in the habit of dividing the world into the New World and the Old World. And it's generally held, it's generally been the view that all civilization began in the Old World. And this book, History Begins at Sumer, by Professor Samuel Noah Kramer, is a hugely influential text. And basically what he's saying is that Sumer, ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, was the first human civilization, first organization of human beings that deserved to be called a civilization. And it's still influential, even though it was first published in 1956. And indeed, this part of the Old World is a center of civilization. There's no doubt about it. I mean, there's the Sumerian Empire. And up there, we have the incredible site of Göbekli Tepe between the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. They call this area Mesopotamia because it means between the rivers. Can't help feeling that there's some connection between what happened in Sumer and what happened much earlier in Göbekli Tepe. But the new evidence from the Americas threatens to overturn this paradigm that places the origins of civilization in the Middle East. The world was so different during the last ice age. There were ice caps 3 kilometers deep. Sea level was 400 feet lower than it is today. And there were freezing temperatures. But then, really rather abruptly, around 11,600 years ago, the Ice Age came to an end. And the whole face of the world changed. Everything became different, and we start to look at the world as we see it today. So there is the conventional notion. There's the Bering Straits now, and there's how they were during the Ice Age. And it did seem obvious to archaeologists that this must have been the main route for getting into the Americas. And indeed, for a long time, they held it was the only route for getting into the Americas. And there was a theory that there had been an ice-free corridor between the Cordillera and the Laurentide ice sheets. That theory, by the way, has been recently completely blown out of the water. Nobody could have used that ice-free corridor because it didn't exist. Here's the general picture of these migrations and through that supposed ice-free corridor and down into North America about 12,000 years ago, and then eventually onwards into South America. It's these genetic discoveries of this close relationship between Australasians and certain peoples in the Amazon rainforest that are challenging the long-held view of the peopling of the Americas. The long-held view became a dogma. And that dogma was called Clovis first. These were supposed to be the Clovis culture, were supposed to be the first inhabitants of North America. And they're not supposed to have come into North America until around 13,400 years ago. And mysteriously, 12,800 years ago, they vanish entirely from the stage. They're recognized by these fantastic fluted points that they made. So they were held to be the first culture of the Americas, and for decades, archaeologists were adamant that no human beings had entered the Americas before 13,400 years ago. But things are beginning to change. This is a report from 2013. Not so long ago, there was a seemingly incontrovertible answer to the question of how and when the first settlers made it to the Americas. Some 13,000 years ago, a group of people from Asia walked across a land bridge that connected Siberia to Alaska and headed south. And these people were known to us as the Clovis. By the way, why do we call them the Clovis culture? They didn't call themselves that. We have no idea what they called themselves that. I'll tell you why. Because there's a site called Blackwater Draw down in New Mexico. And in that site were found many of those Clovis points by archaeologists. But the problem was there was no beer available right there at the site. But where there was beer available was in the town of Clovis, New Mexico, about 10 miles away. So they called it the Clovis culture. Yeah. For decades, this was the received wisdom. So compelling was the Clovis first model that few archaeologists even contemplated an alternative. Some, with the temerity to do so, complained of a Clovis police intent on suppressing dissent. And believe me, the Clovis police was a real thing. It wrecked the lives of quite a number of archaeologists who took a dissenting view and held that it was absurd to suggest that the Americas had only been populated 13,000 years ago. Of course, they'd been populated earlier. And Jacques Cinq-Mars, who conducted excavations at Bluefish Caves in the Yukon, found evidence of the presence of humans in the Americas more than 20,000 years ago. That was heresy to the Clovis Police. They descended upon him. They recruited their friends in the media to attack him, to present him as a pseudoscientist, to say that he was telling lies, to say that he was fraudulently presenting evidence. They did everything possible to ruin his career. And as the Smithsonian later admitted, rather than launching a major new search for more early evidence, the finds stirred fierce opposition and a bitter debate, one of the most acrimonious and unfruitful in all of science, as Nature later put it. And poor Jacques Cinq-Mars, he was ruined by the Clovis Police. His research funding was withdrawn. He was passed by in corridors by colleagues who would no longer speak to him. He was treated as a pariah. He, in every way, was insulted and humiliated. But he was right. But he was right. Because Bluefish Caves were re-excavated. And we now know that people were butchering horses' caves 24,000 years ago. Jacques Cinq-Mars was totally correct, and this more recent research completely vindicates him, but too late to save him from the destruction of his career that fellow archaeologists inflicted upon him. As the Smithsonian admitted in 2017, the study does raise serious questions about the effect of the bitter, decades-long debate over the peopling of the New World. Did archaeologists in the mainstream marginalize dissenting voices on this key issue? And if so, what was the impact on North American archaeology? Did the intense criticism of pre-Clovis sites produce a chilling effect, stifling new ideas and hobbling the search for early sites? The scientific atmosphere, records Tom Dillehay, was clearly toxic and clearly impeded science. So that's March the 8th, 2017. Now, these days, if you talk to archaeologists about Clovis not being first anymore, they'll say, oh, we knew that all along. We've been saying that since the 1990s. Rubbish, rubbish. A few archaeologists have been saying it, but the majority were ganging up on them with the forces of the Clovis Police. So we're told here in 2007 that Clovis was debunked by National Geographic. The Clovis people, known for their distinctive pierheads, were not the first humans to set foot in the Americas after all. That's 2007. 2012, once again, Clovis is debunked. The Clovis theory is put to rest at Paisley Caves. And then Wikipedia, admitting now recently, by the way, I regard Wikipedia as a profound source of disinformation. And I know from looking at Wikipedia entries from a subject that I know about that they're not telling the whole truth. They're presenting an agenda. And I suggest that's probably true for everything that's on Wikipedia. It's the first stop that we all go to get information, but it's not a reliable source. It's a source of disinformation. It's useful, but check everything they say very, very, very carefully. So Clovis, the need to debunk Clovis keeps on happening again and again. It comes back like a sort of zombie, and it has to be killed again. It just won't go away. So here's a 2022 report in the big thing, Clovis debunked. Hey, archaeologists now saying they debunked it in the 90s and in the 2000s, and now in 2022 they're still needing to say it's been debunked. This is an ongoing debate, and we have not got rid of that zombie yet. There are still people clinging to the Clovis first idea. But here's Al Goodyear. Al Goodyear has excavated a site called Topper, which puts man in North America 50,000 years ago. He was subjected to the same kind of attacks that Jacques Cinq-Mars was subjected to. There I am talking with Al Goodyear, and he took me to the site, and he explained that initially they went there to investigate what they thought was entirely a Clovis site. But then they did something that other archaeologists had never done, because archaeologists were told there's no point in looking deeper than Clovis. You know, with these layers in the soil, the younger material is at the top and the older material is at the bottom. They said there's no point in looking deeper because we know that Clovis was first. But Al Goodyear dissented, and he dug deeper. And digging deeper below the Clovis layer, he found compelling evidence that humans had been present more than 50,000 years ago. It's now beginning to be reluctantly accepted by the archaeological community, but R went through decades of hate and unpleasantness because he stood out from the crowd. The Ceruti Mastodon site is another extraordinary site. My God, I mean, those Clovis Police are saying humans were only in America for 13,000 years ago. Here's a site that shows humans were in America 130,000 years ago, 10 times as long. This is the work of paleontologist Tom Desmarais and a number of his colleagues at the San Diego Natural History Museum. And they found a mastodon, the remains of a mastodon, which had clearly been butchered and the marrow extracted by human beings. Exactly what kind of human beings they were 130,000 years ago, we can't say for sure. Because 130,000 years ago, there were Neanderthals, there were Denisovans, there were also anatomically modern humans. But the handiwork of humans is clearly evident in this site. And Tom Desmarais took me backstage in the San Diego Natural History Museum, and he showed me that evidence, and it's utterly compelling. But of course, he was immediately attacked. They don't call them the Clovis Police anymore, but there was just a general attack on what was regarded as the fantastical notion that human beings could have been in the Americas 130,000 years ago. And Tom Desmarais and his team have replied to that attack very thoroughly, refuting it. But the friends of the dead hand of archaeology in the media keep on reporting that it's been debunked. It has not been debunked. Any attempt to debunk it has in fact been debunked by Tom Desmarais and his colleagues. Here's Paulette Steeves. She's a Native American archaeologist, and she is very unhappy with the way that American archaeology is evolving. And she talks about how ignorance is produced through neglect, secrecy, suppression, destruction of documents, unquestioned tradition, and socio-political selectivity. Educational materials were framed in such a way to support colonization of the mind, teaching people to think in ways acceptable to the nation state and not to question so-called scientific authorities. So look, this is why my kids made for me a t-shirt with the words, I'm not wearing it today, but stuff just keeps on getting older. Because you know, if you have a relatively short time frame to deal with, then searching for a lost civilization becomes much more complex and much more difficult. But if you have a very long time frame to deal with, there's much more material to investigate. And if the Americas have been inhabited by humans for 130,000 years, which is more than twice as long as Europe, then our understanding of prehistory must change. We have a vast resource-rich landmass here, and it may have been the location of hitherto unrecognized advances and developments in the story of civilization. But if this were so, why have archaeologists thus far failed to recognize these developments and advances? Well, here's a bit of the open letter that the Society for American Archaeology published and sent to Netflix, complaining about my Ancient Apocalypse series, saying really vile things about it, and demanding that Netflix reclassify it as science fiction, because it doesn't represent the orthodox archaeological point of view. And I'll just read their justification. After more than a century of professional archaeological investigations, we find no archaeological evidence to support the existence of an advanced global Ice Age civilization of the kind Hancock suggests. Archaeologists have investigated hundreds of Ice Age sites and published the results in rigorously reviewed journals. The assertion that Ancient Apocalypse is a factual docuseries or documentary rather than entertainment with ideological goals is preposterous. If there were any credible evidence for a global Ice Age civilization of the kind Hancock suggests, archaeologists would investigate it and report their findings with rigor according to the scientific methods, practices, and theories of our discipline. If the evidence warranted scientific peer review, we would acquire funding to test it, publish our results, and promote it in our own outreach materials. Contrary to Hancock's claims, archaeology does not willfully ignore credible evidence, nor does it seek to suppress it in a conspiratorial fashion. I actually don't think that any conspiracy is going on here. I think people get locked into a particular mindset. Their careers depend on it. The approval of their colleagues depend on it. The funding for their research depends on it. They get invested in that mindset, and they find it very difficult to see outside it. Part of the problem is that very ancient structures, thousands of years older than archaeologists suppose, may be hiding in plain view, surrounded by other younger structures. And the best example of that really is the Great Sphinx of Giza, and these two temples in front of it. This temple is a New Kingdom temple, much later even than the accepted date of the Sphinx, which is about 4,500 years ago. But the Sphinx and these two temples are deeply anomalous, and the erosion patterns in the trench around the Sphinx, and which were originally on the body of the Sphinx before it was restored, speak eloquently of what is called precipitation-induced weathering. And this was first noticed by the late, great John Anthony West, a dear friend of mine, who passed away in 2018. And John West brought Professor Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University, to the site. And Schoch said, it's obvious. This site has been subjected to at least 1,000 years of heavy rainfall. When did that happen? Well, it happened between roughly 12,800 and 11,600 years ago. That's the last time that there were rains capable of causing this level of erosion in the Egyptian desert. See those deep vertical fissures running down there? That's the rainwater pouring off the side of the escarpment and selectively hollowing out the weaker areas of rock. For most of the 20th century, it was the consensus of archaeologists that megalithic architecture was beyond the capacities of hunter-gatherers and required the presence of long-term settled agricultural communities to evolve. And it seemed to reinforce this view that no megalithic architecture had been found anywhere in the world that was more than 6,000 years old. In fact, that was one of the main arguments that the archaeological police used to try to dismiss John West and Robert Schoch. They said, show us another culture that's 12,000 years old anywhere in the world, and we might listen to you. But we know that there is no culture capable of creating anything like the Sphinx until 4,500 years ago. Therefore, of course, the Sphinx is 4,500 years ago. But of course, that changed completely with Göbekli Tepe, which is a deliberately buried site, deliberately buried 11,600 years ago, a very, very ancient site. Sorry, it began 11,600 years ago. It was deliberately buried about 1,000 years later, and thus sealed, and thus an intact archaeological scene. And the evidence from Göbekli Tepe is that this site is 11,600 years old. It dates to the end of a period called the Younger Dryas, which I'll talk a bit more about. And my goodness, if you're capable of creating these 20-ton megalithic pillars and this huge site, then you're certainly capable of creating the Great Sphinx. So the notion that the Sphinx is somehow out of context has to completely change now that we have Göbekli Tepe. I'm here with the late Professor Klaus Schmidt, who, unlike most archaeologists, did not sort of make the sign of the cross and run away as soon as I appeared on the site, but actually gave me 3 days of his time and talked me through the site in great depth. Tragically, he passed away in 2014, and he's been succeeded by a very closed-minded group of archaeologists. What he's telling me, why he's pointing at the ground, is that there's hundreds of pillars as yet unexcavated, still deeply buried under the ground, huge enclosures under the ground that they haven't excavated yet. But now Karahan Tepe has been excavated, and this is how it looks today. An extraordinary megalithic site of the same age as Göbekli Tepe, around about 11,000, 11,600 years ago. Here we have pillars carved directly out of the bedrock, and then one freestanding pillar included there, and then this curious face sticking out of the wall, which I must say gave me the chills the first time I saw it. I don't know what it's about. It's got a sort of snake-like feeling and with a human head on the end of a snake's body. So there is reason to conclude that the Sphinx does not stand alone. that there are now recognized archaeological sites which involve huge amounts of workmanship that are as old as the Sphinx. And I wonder if some other sites have been misinterpreted, if sites are multi-layered, that many different cultures have been involved in them, and archaeology is perhaps making the mistake of just dating them to the most recent culture.